Yeah, thank you. So I'm Djarra Delaney. I'm stand a bit back. It's loud. It's sort of powerful. So I'm a Quandamooka man. So I'm from that's Minjerribah, Mulgumpin. Minjerribah is North Stradbroke Island. Mulgumpin is Moreton Island in Moreton Bay, so Southeast Queensland. And our country goes from those islands through to the many Bay Islands and out to Wynnum. And borders with the Yagara tribes to the east, we've got Gubbi to the north, and the Yirriganjdji tribal groups to the south, or Yagara. So that's kind of where I'm situated as an Aboriginal person. And yeah, so I'm kind of coming here in two kind of ways. I'm representing myself and my academic background, which is in adaptation, as well as kind of, I'll talk a little bit about the National First Peoples platform at the end. But I thought for this, I'm just going to kind of set up the problem in a lot of ways. And yeah, we'll get to it. So I want to echo the acknowledgement. Wiradjuri, Wurrung people. I want to pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging community leaders. I want to pay respects to my own community, Quandamooka, and my elders, as well as all First Nations people here and online. So slight trigger warning in the start. I'm going to be talking about a lot of structural issues around the impacts of colonisation and the way they play out in mitigation, adaptation, land management generally, and things like that. So if I come across it very strong, it's not a personal, I'm not reflecting on your personal careers or the things that you work on. I'm talking about structural problems. All right, let's minimize. So generally for me, the problem of climate change really is about the historical impacts of colonisation as a process that occurred here in this country. And the kind of current colonial power forces that are at work now that don't do much to build resilience for First Nations communities or other communities, to be honest. And in many cases, they're just reinforcing the same systems, the same policies and practices that contributed to this long history of impact. And I think what's important to recognise when it comes to the conversation around climate change is that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait people and other First Nations people around the world, it isn't a new problem. It's not an emergent issue. It is just the next impact in a long, long line of environmental and social consequences of kind of exploitation and expansion. So I think it's really important to understand that it's on that continuum. It doesn't have a kind of a start when, you know, the concept was invented, and it is just a kind of a continual process of negative change in the environment. And so for me, and for, you know, a lot of First Nations people and other groups, you know, a just future has to start with redressing historical and contemporary issues of colonisation. So we're going to start here. Terra Nullius, that's by Uncle Gordon Siren. So Terra Nullius essentially is the start of the kind of conversation of climate change in the Australian context. So Terra Nullius meaning empty land, that was kind of declared by Burke in 1835, so almost 50 years after invasion. So you'd think that they would have realised that that is not true, but you know, that mechanism of empty land essentially opened the doors for close to 200 years of exploitation, expansion, genocide, massacre, ecocide, and a complete restructuring of the Australian landscape into the current regime. So, you know, when we talk about transformation in the context of climate change, Australia is thoroughly transformed already. So the current landscape is changed. And that's an important point to remember. And now that wasn't overturned until 1992 with the Mabo decision, which then brought into reality that there are legal, there was an existing legal framework in Australia prior and continues to be to this day, as well as people. So a lot of the consequences, so that's going to compound existing impacts of colonisation in a transformed landscape. The changes and the loss of traditional knowledges through forced removal, language suppression, mission schools, residential schooling, stolen generation, all of it, as well as disease, death, war, massacre. And the change of the landscape has put significant pressure on communities in responding to climate change, as it is today. Expected seasons are different. Landscapes are very different from where that knowledge was generated through. And although it's adaptive and has changed along with landscape change, it's not keeping up. It's too quick. That's true for impacts of colonisation and climate as well. Social economic barriers, histories of violence, health barriers, and I talk about this thing sometimes, which is kind of the paralysis of issues. You know, if you've got health issues, justice issues, education issues, social issues that you have to deal with in communities, if you've got kids not going to school, if you've got all these things occurring at once, how are you supposed to get the brain space and the energy to even respond to impacts of colonisation on an actual meaningful level? It's very difficult to just create space for that conversation to occur. And exclusion from decision making. So I'm just going to talk kind of through them really quickly. So there is a case to be made that mitigation action in Australia is following the same pathways of expansion and exploitation without any First Nations oversight or decision making built into the process. There's little recognition in mitigation of the realities of land theft in Australia. First Nations people should be receiving compensatory benefits from any mitigation projects in our land and sea country. That's a reality. It's not talked about very often, if at all. If you're going to do a major development project on First Nations land, they should receive compensation for the change that is going to occur in that landscape, regardless of how positive it might be. And it's re-entrenching the kind of concept of terra nullius generally across the board. Adaptation, same. It's based on the limiting Western epistemology. I'm going to kind of try and speed this one up. So resilience, vulnerability, and risk are not necessarily the right concepts, and they're interpreted through a pretty narrow lens. And it's often focused on Indigenous knowledge, which is an issue because Indigenous knowledge is not there to be co-opted. It's there to be shared with non-Indigenous people on a case-by-case basis, determined by the community where it's appropriate. And I think the language used around adaptation is a lot to do with Indigenous knowledges could help the world adapt to climate change. Why would we do that? In many cases, adaptation is being kind of like a top-down approach, whether or not that is seawalls in the Torres Strait or very specific adaptation activities that are approved by the government. And adaptation from a community perspective is occurring. It's very much experimentation. It's very much art. It's very much looking at landscape management from a local lens where funding isn't available or is refused to support those type of initiatives. Quick example, artist Megan Coate, her new art installation in Minjerribah in the mudflats is about traditional oyster bank revitalisation and it's done in an artistic way, and it's done through an arts grant, but it is adaptation. And so that's the kind of avenues that have to be taken. Again, carbon and biodiversity credits. I think there is a strong argument that any carbon and biodiversity credits markets in Australia must pay reparations. If land has been stolen, which it has, and carbon biodiversity credit markets emerge in Australia, then without a core conversation around reparations built into that mathematics, or that kind of if that's not acknowledged within that market space, then it's just going to re-entrench financial exclusion of First Nations people at the expense of their country. And this has been seen in Canada with the carbon farming market, where forests were essentially planted by non-Indigenous peoples, and then First Nations communities were locked out of that space. So a couple of slides left. What can be done about this? Government pressure, change of policy. We have to change the future acts regime within the native title legislation. It's allowing far too much to occur.
So one clarification, but a renewable energy development is a future act under, yes.
Yes. Clear compensatory terms, increased financial support. Community networking provides the checks and balances. So isolation is a product of the colonial regime. Communities are isolated from each other. We weren't ever isolated from each other. Songlines are the original networking on this country, and that was disrupted by colonisation, and must re-emerge and must be key to supporting the future of climate action. And two examples: National First Peoples Platform on Climate Change. That is a co-designed process. So NEST, National Environmental Science Program, has got a National First Peoples Platform, which guides the kind of development of the gathering. And I think this is a good example of a kind of government invested opportunity. I think the original intention was to have it kind of like, you know, two-way sharing, but what's happened is it's actually been subverted by First Nations peoples to be a kind of a premier network event where they get together, talk about shared issues, and kind of hoover up all the knowledge of Western scientists, which I think is awesome. You know, that's kind of what is needing to occur in that space before two-way knowledge sharing can even become a conversation. But it has put collective pressure on governments, and that's great. So we can change kind of some legislative things, or try and argue for more monies, or do some of these things from a kind of embedded level. And then the Torres Strait, I think, is an example of a First Nations led networking. I think the networking part is often forgotten. It's just 8 different community groups, all with their own language, all with their own impacts, all with their own histories. And I won't read all this out because I don't know what time I've got, but I think it's an interesting example of a completely First Nations led and kind of revolutionary, or you know, a type of networking that could occur more and more, particularly as it comes to like internal legal battles. I don't think, unfortunately, nothing kind of happened after Australia got wrapped on the knuckles, but you know, I think with more pressure from these type of things, we could see some serious retaliatory legal cases brought in.